The dog was dying, and she shouldn't have cared. In a dusty U.S. internment camp for Japanese POWs under the Texas sun, a young woman knelt beside the barbed wire fence, cradling a limp body in her arms. The German shepherd, once fierce and proud, was barely breathing now, its flank heaving, eyes glazed. It had been the American's dog, a guard dog, her jailer's companion. And yet, here she was, pressing a wet rag to its blood-matted fur, whispering words in a language the dog would never understand. Around her, no one moved, not even the guards. The night before, a rattlesnake had struck, and the dog had collapsed by the fence line. Most thought it would die before morning, but not her. When the cowboys from the local ranch rode in at dawn, sent to round up stray cattle, the scene they found left them slack-jawed in silence. The dog was standing, alive, and curled up at its side, fast asleep, was the prisoner who saved it. The camp was quiet that morning, as if the earth itself held its breath. Dust drifted lazily through the air, kicked up by nothing in particular. Barbed wire fences stretched in precise lines toward a low horizon, cutting the sky into fragments. Guard towers stood like watchful giants, unmoving. The Texas sun rose slowly, casting long shadows across the barracks, the mess hall, the chapel. It was a place that looked like it had been built not just to hold people, but to forget them, to disappear them into routines and fences and silence. Amarillo was not a cruel camp, at least not in the way most prisoners expected. It was something stranger, a contradiction. There were no beatings, no starvation, no shouts in the night. But there was control, absolute and quiet. Eyes always watching, orders always followed. Dignity was not stripped by force, but by heat, boredom, and isolation. Yuki arrived in late spring, her hands bound loosely with cloth, her uniform in tatters, her shoes nearly worn through. She did not weep. She did not speak. Her eyes were fixed forward, unfocused, as if she had already vanished into some private exile. A few guards murmured that she must have been important once. Her posture was straight, too straight for someone so young. One of them guessed she was 20. Another said 25. The truth was 23. She had been a field nurse stationed in Saipan before the surrender. She had seen things there no one asked her to describe, and so she didn't. She arrived with no luggage, no family, and no illusions. Her country had fallen. Her commanders had vanished. She was a soldier without a war, a woman without a future. She expected nothing. But on the second day, during the morning sweep of the yard, she saw the dog. He sat by the far end of the inner perimeter, beneath the shade of a leaning pine. A large German shepherd, shoulders square, ears alert, fur bristled like old brush. His name, she later learned, was Rex. He belonged to the sergeant who ran the gate patrols, trained for intimidation, not affection. His bark could stop a man in motion. His bite could tear through canvas and flesh alike. The other prisoners avoided him. Even the guards kept a respectful distance. But he didn't bark at Yuki. Not once. He simply watched her with a sharp, silent stillness, and she, in return, watched him back. That first glance was brief, the second, longer. By the end of the week, their eyes had met a dozen times, each without event, yet each lingering longer than before. Yuki didn't know why she looked. Maybe it was because Rex seemed as out of place as she did. In a camp built on hierarchy, he obeyed no one but his master. In a place that fed on silence, he answered only to instinct. He was a prisoner of a different kind, perhaps, kept not by walls, but by duty. She learned his rhythms, morning rounds, afternoon rest, evening patrol, and he learned hers. The slow sweep of the broom across the dirt yard, the stop at the mess for coffee grounds to scrub the pots, the way she paused near the infirmary window where the light was softest in the late hours. They did not interact, not yet, but each knew where the other was, a strange kind of gravity. Yuki never smiled, not even when the American guards cracked jokes to fill the empty air. She answered only when spoken to, and even then only in fragments. Hi. No. Don't know. Her English was functional but sharp, like a tool never meant for conversation. She kept her hands clean, her face passive, and her eyes lowered. This wasn't submission, it was armor. She had been trained for hardship. In Saipan, the dead were wrapped in rice sacks. Morphine ran out in the first week. Suffering was expected. Compassion was luxury. And survival was a kind of theft. And yet, for reasons she couldn't name, she kept glancing at the dog. One evening, as the guards swapped shifts and the sun poured gold across the dirt, Rex passed close to her during a patrol lap. He slowed, just for a second, and his snout turned toward her. Not hostile, just curious. Then he moved on. That night, Yuki couldn't sleep. Not because of fear, but because she had felt noticed. In the days that followed, something unspoken began to grow. Not friendship, not yet, but a tension, quiet and strange, a flicker of something neither of them could name. And as the summer wore on and the days bled together, it would be this unnoticed thread, the silent presence of a dog and the watching eyes of a woman, that would set into motion the story no one saw coming, a story that would crack the image of enemy and prisoner, of beast and girl, of lines drawn in dust and sand. Because before surrender ever tasted like stew and soap, there had to be dust. And in the dust, a dog. And beside the dog, a woman who was supposed to feel nothing. But Yuki did feel something, even if she refused to name it. She told herself it was curiosity, nothing more, a reflex from the war years when observation was survival. But this wasn't a battlefield. There were no sirens, no gunfire, no groaning stretchers lining the infirmary floor, just endless wind, sand, and the rhythm of daily chores. And yet each time she saw the dog, her spine tensed, not in fear, but in something else, something she had no training for. Her discipline had once been her shield. At 17, she'd taken the oath of service, not just with her voice, but with her whole body. Her hands learned how to bind wounds, how to administer morphine, how to ignore cries that could not be helped. Her instructors had made it clear. Emotion was wasteful. Attachment was weakness. Pain was not to be soothed. It was to be endured. In war, there was no room for softness. A nurse's job was not to comfort, but to function, to make broken men whole enough to return to killing. In those early weeks at Amarillo, Yuki lived by that code still. She did her tasks precisely, wordlessly. She folded linens into perfect squares, scrubbed pots until her fingers wrinkled. She never slouched, never lingered, never asked questions. She bowed her head when spoken to and avoided the eyes of other prisoners. But not Rex's, never Rex's. He didn't growl at her, even though he did at others. Once, she saw him bare his teeth at a prisoner who had shouted something in Japanese too loud for the guard's liking. Another time, he lunged against the leash when a man tried to cross the boundary line without permission. But with Yuki, he never moved. He only sat, alert, silent, still. And she would glance his way just once per hour, once per day, and then a little more, until she began to anticipate the moment. The Americans noticed, though they said little. One guard, Private Marks, joked under his breath that the Jap girl and the dog were having a standoff. Another muttered that it was probably just nerves. Animals could smell tension. But Sergeant Conway, the dog's handler, said nothing. He watched Yuki, too, and when he saw her hesitate near the laundry line to watch Rex scratch behind his ear, he didn't intervene. He simply turned his back. Yuki began to notice more details. The scar above Rex's left paw, the way his tail thumped once against the ground when the cook brought out leftovers, the way his ears twitched at sudden movement, but never when she passed. She noticed he limped sometimes, subtly, like a shadow that had followed him from another war. She wondered if he, too, had seen things that stayed lodged behind the eyes. Loneliness is not always loud. It can exist in perfect silence. In the routine of measured steps, in the sound of wind against a tin roof, in the absence of your name being spoken for weeks. Yuki's days were filled with action but devoid of contact. She cleaned beside others, but rarely heard them speak. Even when they did, their voices held no warmth. She had come from a nation of collapse, from fire and surrender. She carried that defeat in her posture, in her silence. Rex, too, seemed apart from the men who fed him. He did not wag his tail at commands. He did not nuzzle or whimper or beg. He obeyed, but without devotion. He was a weapon repurposed into something softer, and he wasn't sure how to be that yet. In that uncertainty, Yuki saw herself. There was a moment, brief, unimportant to anyone else, when she passed him one morning and he let out a low exhale, a sound closer to a sigh than a growl. She stopped walking. Their eyes met, and in that pause, something passed between them, neither kindness nor affection, but something raw, recognition. She moved on, but for the rest of that day, her hands trembled when she folded towels, and she didn't know why. That night she dreamed of Saipan. Not the dying men, not the bombs, just the sound of dogs barking in the hills. One bark, echoing, then silence, then the scratching of paws against dry earth. When she woke up, the sun was rising, and Rex was already sitting at the fence, waiting, watching, as if he too had not slept. That evening, the heat clung low to the dirt, and the light turned a dusty gold, stretching the shadows long across the compound. It was the quietest time of day, before the call for supper, before the stars blinked over the wire. Yuki had just finished cleaning the laundry troughs, her hands raw from scrubbing, when she heard the yelp, not a bark, not a growl, a sound of pain, sharp and ragged. The whole camp seemed to freeze. Near the west fence, a cluster of soldiers had gathered to inspect a hole that had opened under the outer perimeter, probably from burrowing armadillos. Rex had been sniffing along the edge, alert. That's when it happened. A flash of motion in the grass, a coiled blur, a strike. The rattlesnake was thick and pale, nearly the color of the dust itself. No one saw it until it struck. The men jumped back. One of them cursed and dropped his clipboard. Another fumbled for his rifle, but too late. The snake had already recoiled into the grass. Rex let out a second, broken sound and stumbled back from the fence line, then collapsed. He didn't move. It was Yuki who moved first. She had seen the entire thing from 50 feet away. She didn't think. She didn't ask. She didn't care. Her body moved before her mind gave permission, sprinting across the yard, bare feet kicking up dirt, crossing the invisible line that separated prisoner from perimeter. Guards shouted. Hands moved toward holsters, but none fired, none even raised a weapon. She dropped to her knees beside the dog. He was panting, hard, tongue lolling, his back leg twitching. The puncture wound was clear, a swelling welt just above his paw, already beginning to darken. Yuki pressed her hand against his chest. His heartbeat was there, but weak, fluttering. Poison was in him now, threading through muscle and vein. "Get back!" One of the soldiers barked, but another, Conway, held up a hand. "Wait," he said. His voice was quiet, unreadable. No one moved. Yuki tore a strip from her already worn uniform and began cleaning the wound. The smell of blood rose, metallic and warm. She checked the mouth, the gums, pale. His breath was fast and shallow. She whispered to him in Japanese, barely audible. Not words of comfort, just instinct, repetition, like she had done in the field tents when the boys bled out beneath her fingers, like she had done when nothing else could be done. "She's a medic," someone muttered. "Was," another corrected. "Now she's a prisoner." Conway said nothing. His hand was clenched around the fence wire, white-knuckled. She pressed cool water against Rex's neck, trying to lower his temperature. She pinched the skin above the bite, trying to draw blood. It wasn't much, but it was something. When the camp nurse came running, an older American woman with a limp, Yuki didn't step aside. She looked up once, then went back to work. The nurse crouched beside her, wordless, handing her a clean cloth. The two women said nothing, but the silence between them was thick with understanding. The guards didn't pull her away. Maybe it was the urgency. Maybe it was the image. This Japanese girl in tattered clothes cradling their dog like a wounded child. Maybe it was the way her hands moved, not gentle, but precise, practiced. Or maybe they had simply forgotten for a moment what side she was on. Night came slowly, and Yuki never left his side. She kept his head cool, his legs straight. When he convulsed once, she held him still until the tremor passed. Her knees ached, her back throbbed. But she stayed. When the guards brought a lantern, she didn't thank them. When one of the women from the barracks brought her a cup of water, she didn't drink it. She was somewhere else now, back in the blood-soaked tents, back with the boys whose names she never knew, back in the war she thought had ended. Only this time the patient wasn't a soldier. He had no flag, no side, just breath, just pain. By midnight the camp had gone quiet, except for the low hum of insects and the rustle of wind through dry grass. And still, no one made her leave. No one stopped her. And that, perhaps, was the strangest thing of all. They let her stay by the fence. No one told her to leave, no orders barked, no rifles raised. The guards who once monitored her every movement now passed by without a word, their boots crunching softly in the dust, as if unwilling to break the spell hanging over the yard. As darkness deepened and the stars bled into the sky, Yuki remained kneeling beside Rex, tending to him with the same discipline she had once given the wounded in Saipan's crumbling hospitals. Except this time, it was not duty that moved her hands. It was something older, something quieter. She had always believed detachment was a form of strength. Back in the Pacific, she'd kept her emotions sealed behind the rituals of war medicine. Boil the gauze, swab the wound, inject the morphine, move to the next man. Their pain was never hers. If it became hers, she would break. And breaking was not allowed. Not for women, not for nurses, not for anyone who served. But this dog, this strange watching animal who had never growled, never barked at her like the others, had cracked something open. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to care. Yet as Rex whimpered in his sleep and twitched against the throes of venom, she tore the last clean strip from her blouse and placed it beneath his head so it wouldn't rest in the dirt. It was too small to matter, but it mattered to her. The guards, too, were changed. There was no protocol for this, no column in the rule-book for compassion during snakebite. They didn't know how to process what they were seeing. A Japanese POW, the supposed enemy, voluntarily exhausting herself to keep an American military dog alive. Some stood leaning against the fence, arms crossed, saying nothing. Others smoked cigarettes without lighting a second one, watching her from the glow of the guard posts, like spectators at a strange new ritual. Conway came down from his post twice during the night. The first time, he brought a tin bowl of boiled rice and meat scraps from the mess hall. He set it down without a word, just outside the range of the dog's twitching legs. The second time, closer to dawn, he brought a blanket. Yuki didn't look up, but she took it. Inside the barracks, the other women stirred in their bunks. Some peered through the slats, eyes wide in the dim light. One whispered, "Is she still out there?" Another replied, "She hasn't moved." A third added, "They're letting her." That was what unsettled them most. Not that Yuki was breaking form, but that no one was stopping her. The camp, normally defined by its lines between prisoner and guard, enemy and ally, human and animal, had softened. Like chalk under rain, the edges blurred. Yuki, who had spent weeks avoiding notice, had become the center of it. Not through defiance, not through anger, but through stillness. She dipped a cloth in water and touched it to Rex's ears. His breathing was steadier now, if still shallow. She placed 2 fingers on his ribs and counted. Then she waited. The stars rotated overhead. Time did not pass so much as it stretched, like gauze being pulled across a wound. And through it all, no one dared speak. What changed that night could not be named. There was no order given, no rule altered. And yet something shifted, an invisible current in the camp's atmosphere. Respect, perhaps, or recognition, or simply a pause in the long, grinding rhythm of captivity. At one point near midnight, a young guard passed close to the fence. He paused, hesitated, then whispered through the wire, "You don't have to do this." Yuki didn't answer. She didn't understand every word, but she understood the tone. She glanced up, then back to Rex. Her silence was answer enough. And so the night pressed on. Yuki at the fence, her back straight, despite the ache, her hands resting on the dog's flank. Rex breathing, uneven but alive. Around them, the camp held its breath, not out of fear but reverence. No one slept easily, not the prisoners, not the guards. No one quite knew why. But by morning, everyone would remember. The sun broke across the plains like a slow breath, casting long golden beams through the gaps in the fence. The camp stirred, but gently, as if afraid to disturb what had taken root in the night. The dust still clung to the yard, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt hushed, reverent. Then, from beyond the camp's northern border, came the distant creak of saddle leather and the soft jangle of spurs. Every few weeks, local cowboys from the nearby Wilkins Ranch rode in to collect cattle that had strayed too close to the military fences. These visits were routine, unnoticed, even unremarkable. The men would arrive with quiet nods, tip their hats to the guards, mutter about fences and feed, and leave without asking too many questions. But this morning, as they approached, one of them pulled his horse to a stop, squinting toward the gate. What he saw wasn't routine at all. There, lying on her side in the dirt, curled into a crescent of exhaustion, was a young woman in a torn uniform, her hands resting lightly on the ribcage of a massive German shepherd. The dog's chest rose and fell, slow, steady, alive. The scene struck them like a freeze frame in a dream. Stillness. Dust. Silence. The lead cowboy dismounted, boots crunching on gravel. He walked to the gate and leaned forward. "She one of yours?" he asked the nearest guard. The soldier nodded slowly. "POW?" The cowboy removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair. "Ain't seen anything like that before," he said. His voice was low, respectful, not amused, not skeptical, just awed. The other men joined him. They didn't ask questions, they didn't laugh or whisper crude things like they might have a month ago. They just stood there, watching. One of them pulled out a flask and offered it silently to the guard. No one drank. Yuki stirred beneath the thin blanket someone had thrown over her in the early hours. Her eyelids fluttered. Rex shifted beside her, letting out a low, questioning whine. When her eyes opened, the first thing she saw was not the fence or the sun or the watchtower. It was a horse, a huge, mottled gray creature standing just yards away, its reins dangling loose. Then came the voice again. "Mornin', miss." She blinked, slowly lifting herself onto one elbow. Her hair was tangled, her blouse stained with blood and dust, her expression unreadable. But she didn't flinch, she didn't recoil. She just nodded, almost imperceptibly. The cowboy tipped his hat. There was a kind of poetry to it, the silent respect of a Texas ranch hand for a girl he'd never met, a girl who by all accounts was supposed to be an enemy. But war has strange rules, and sometimes no rules at all. In that moment, he wasn't seeing a prisoner. He was seeing a human being who had done something few others could. She had stayed. She had cared. She had kept death away, if only for one more night. The symbolism wasn't lost on the guards either. They had lived in a world of clear lines, black and white, ally and foe, dog and prisoner. But the cowboys? They were outsiders, unburdened by uniforms or chains of command. They called things as they saw them, and what they saw now, leaning against the fence, was a truth no one needed explained. They watched as Yuki stood, legs trembling, and brushed the dust from her knees. Rex followed slowly, his head low, but his tail lifting slightly. Not a wag, not quite, but movement, life. The cowboys backed away, giving them space. "We'll come back later," one muttered, almost embarrassed to have intruded. And just like that, they turned their horses, mounted up, and rode off into the morning. No ceremony, no fuss, just silence. But their eyes, those quiet, weather-worn eyes, said everything, because they hadn't just seen a prisoner. They had seen a story unfold in dirt and silence and blood. They had seen mercy, and in a world torn apart by war, mercy was the rarest sight of all. Days later, Rex limped through the compound beside a watchful Yuki, his gait still uneven but improving. The wound had closed, the swelling faded, and although he moved slower, he moved. That alone was a miracle. The prisoners whispered when they passed. So did the guards. They didn't speak to Yuki, not directly, but eyes followed her now. Some nodded, some simply looked away, unsure of how to process the strange alchemy that had taken place at the fence line. But no story they whispered could explain the truth of what happened. Not really, because the truth didn't live in that night. It lived somewhere far away, thousands of miles across the Pacific, in a canvas tent, in blood-soaked sheets, in the dying gasps of a boy Yuki could not save. She had been 20 years old. The boy's name was Masaru, 17, maybe 18. He had taken shrapnel to the abdomen during the retreat from Guam. When they brought him to the field tent, he was already screaming. They placed him in the corner, too far gone for transport, too unstable for surgery. Her superior gave her a glance that meant only one thing: keep him comfortable. Let him pass quietly. There were other men to save, but Masaru didn't pass quietly. For 2 days he thrashed. He begged for water, then spat it out. He clawed at the bedroll. He called for his mother until his throat gave out. Yuki did everything she could. She changed the dressings. She murmured to him. She sang lullabies she half remembered from childhood, even though she was told not to. And when his fever peaked, she knelt beside him, pressing her palm to his forehead, whispering nonsense words, any words, to distract him from the dark. She told herself he might make it. He didn't. Just before dawn on the third day, he went quiet. No final gasp, no whispered goodbye, just stillness. Yuki sat there long after the body cooled, unable to move. Her knees were numb, her face streaked with tears she didn't remember shedding. And when her commanding officer pulled back the tent flap and said, "He's gone?" she didn't answer. She just stood, walked out, and vomited into the sand. That was the moment something inside her closed. Not broke. Closed. Like a door sealed from the inside. No more soft glances. No more lingering at a patient's side. From that day forward, she worked with a precision that frightened even the doctors. She refused to treat anyone for more than 10 minutes. She didn't ask names. She didn't look anyone in the eye. And she certainly never sang. When the war ended, she felt nothing. No grief, no relief, just silence. Until Rex, who didn't speak, who didn't cry, who didn't beg. He just looked at her, trusted her. Not with words, but with his breath, his weight, his wound. And Yuki had responded before thought could interfere. Her body had remembered something her mind had buried. In saving him, she had remembered Masaru. Not his death, his eyes, his fear, his helpless, human, all fragility. Rex had unlocked that memory without warning, and now, as he limped beside her, tail swaying in the slow wind, she felt something else, something heavy and raw. It wasn't guilt, it was grief, but it was a grief with teeth dulled by time, a grief softened by the simple fact that this time someone had lived. She didn't speak about Masaru. She never would. But each time she bent to check Rex's paw, each time she watched him sleep beneath the shade of the mess hall roof, she remembered. Not just him, but who she had been before him. The girl who sang lullabies, the girl who thought mercy was enough. Rex had become her first patient since the war. But more than that, he was the first soul she had let inside the walls she'd built around her heart. And though she would never admit it aloud, she knew now those walls were beginning to crack. The cracking didn't go unnoticed. Within days of Rex's return to his post, albeit slower, with a limp that would never fully leave him, the guards began to call Yuki something new. Doc, sometimes Miss Doc, half joking, half reverent. The kind of name that stuck to a person when there were no medals to give. Only nods across the yard and silent respect carved from something unspoken. Conway used it first, almost under his breath, as he passed her a tin of ointment for the dog's paw. Others followed, but not everyone approved. Inside the women's barracks, where bunk beds groaned beneath the heat and resentment grew like mildew, Yuki's name began to carry weight of a different kind. The whispers sharpened. Why did they let her stay out all night? Why does she get to treat the dog? Why is she smiling when she thinks no one sees? For prisoners who lived by the rhythm of hunger and suspicion, her bond with an American animal, a guard animal, reeked of betrayal. It didn't help that Yuki had never been one of them, not really. She kept to herself, folded her blanket too neatly, washed her clothes even when water was low. Her silence had once been seen as strength. Now it became a veil behind which treachery might hide. Even the other Japanese women, her former comrades in uniforms long since stripped away, began to distance themselves. They didn't accuse her outright. There was no evidence, no broken rule. But isolation doesn't need proof. It just needs a pause, a glance, held 1 second too long. A conversation that stops when you enter the room. So Yuki did the one thing she had avoided for months. She asked for paper. She said it was for a letter. The clerk in the admin tent blinked at her request, shrugged, and gave her 1 sheet. She wrote slowly over 3 days in the dim light of her bunk, her knees drawn to her chest like a child hiding in memory. Her handwriting, once surgical, now trembled. The letter was addressed to Hiroshima, to her younger sister, if she was still alive. If the address still existed, if the world hadn't already swallowed both. She didn't mention the war, she didn't explain the camp. But the letter breathed with something raw. "I saved an enemy's dog," she wrote. "I think it saved something in me, too." She didn't elaborate. She folded the letter 3 times, sealed it with spit, and handed it to Conway without a word. He didn't promise it would reach Japan. He didn't ask what was inside. He just took it, nodded once, and slipped it into the pouch on his belt. That night, Yuki sat by the fence again. Though Rex was already sleeping, the moon cast pale stripes through the barbed wire. She watched the horizon like she was waiting for something. Not a ship, not a plane, just silence. Clean silence. The next day, someone moved her shoes. The day after that, a rice bowl went missing. None of it mattered. She no longer belonged to the world of them versus us. Not fully. And while the sting of exile burned, it no longer ruled her. She had already crossed a different kind of line, one drawn not by war, but by mercy. She still bowed in the morning, still swept the yard, still stitched her blouse where it frayed. But something in her posture had changed. She carried no pride, no defiance, only acceptance. And even in that loneliness, there was peace, because for the first time since Masaru's death, she had not walked away. She had stayed. She had saved. And whatever that made her now, prisoner, traitor, nurse, she could live with it. Weeks passed. Texas summer bled into cooler winds, and the dust no longer stuck to the skin like punishment. Rex walked again, stiffly at first, his back leg dragging slightly on bad days. But he walked. He no longer snarled at the prisoners, no longer barked when gates clanged shut. Instead, he followed Yuki. Every morning, as she swept the gravel outside the infirmary or folded linens in the sun, Rex would find her. He would sit nearby, tongue lolling, eyes alert, but only to her. The guards noticed. At first they joked. Guess he knows who saved his hide. But in time, the jokes quieted, replaced by something closer to respect. Even Conway stopped trying to call the dog with whistles. Rex didn't come, not anymore. It was never official. No one reassigned the dog. No paperwork changed hands. But something had shifted. Rex belonged to Yuki now. Or maybe Yuki belonged to Rex. Their companionship never shouted. There were no tricks, no commands, just a kind of parallel movement. She swept. He sat. She walked. He followed. She rested beneath the cottonwood tree outside the barracks, and he lay at her feet. Always in silence, always with that watchful loyalty only dogs seem to understand. The rest of the camp began to soften. Not all at once, not with fanfare, but subtly. Guards stopped spitting near the barracks. Extra bread appeared in the women's bowls. Someone, no one ever confessed, left a clean roll of bandages outside the infirmary door every Sunday morning. It wasn't kindness. Not exactly. It was recognition. Yuki's presence no longer felt foreign. It felt central. And with Rex beside her, the lines blurred further. No one could forget she was Japanese, but now, when they looked at her, they saw something else layered beneath. Nurse, caretaker, survivor. The story became folklore. New guards heard it on their first day. "You see that woman over there? That's Doc. She saved the dog." Some scoffed, some nodded. A few, upon seeing Rex sit protectively at her feet, went silent altogether. Then one afternoon, a jeep rolled in from the south gate. Out stepped a man in a gray uniform with a red cross stitched over his chest. He was British, tall and pale, with round spectacles that caught the sun. "I'm here to see the dog doctor," he said. The guard at the gate scratched his head. "You mean the medic?" The officer shook his head. "No, the dog doctor, the one I read about in the report." Someone fetched Conway. Conway fetched Yuki. She emerged from the infirmary in her usual way, quiet, composed, with the sleeves of her faded blouse rolled neatly above her wrists. Rex followed, nose twitching at the stranger's cologne. When they stopped a few feet away, the Red Cross man removed his hat and bowed slightly. "Ma'am," he said, glancing down at Rex, "that's one hell of a patient." Yuki didn't answer. She didn't know the words, but she understood the tone. She gave a small bow in return, then placed her hand on Rex's back. The dog sat. The officer didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He just stood with them for a while, notebook in hand, occasionally scribbling something down. Later, he would send a report to Geneva. It would mention a female prisoner of war who provided unsanctioned veterinary care to a guard dog, resulting in a full recovery. It would cite humanitarian integrity, extraordinary empathy, and a rare case of cross-cultural healing. But in that moment, under the cottonwood tree, there were no headlines. Just a woman, a dog, and a war that, for one flickering moment, had loosened its grip. If you're enjoying this story, like the video and comment below where you're watching from. Your support helps us tell more untold histories. Then came the order. Yuki was to be transferred to another camp. No explanation, no appeal. She didn't flinch, but Rex wouldn't leave her side. On the day of her departure, he sat at the gate, unmoving. When the trucks rolled out, he howled once, long, low, and final. The news arrived on a thin slip of paper, delivered by a clerk with ink-stained fingers and an apologetic look. Transfers were common in the labyrinth of wartime bureaucracy, names shuffled, numbers reassigned, prisoners relocated without pattern or mercy. It was how the system maintained control, unpredictability masquerading as order. But this one landed like a blow. Conway read it twice, jaw tightening. He looked at Yuki, then at Rex, who sat with his head resting on her foot, as if sensing the shift in the air. "You're being moved," Conway said quietly. "South Camp. Transport leaves in 2 days." Yuki only nodded. No emotion touched her face. She had learned long ago that the world offered little comfort to those who mourned out loud. She folded the paper, tucked it into her blouse, and bowed. It was the closest she came to goodbye. But Rex understood immediately. That night, he refused to return to the kennel. He pushed past the handlers, claws scraping, ears flat, tail stiff. He found Yuki outside the barracks, sitting alone beneath the cottonwood tree, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. She didn't call to him. She didn't gesture. Yet he came and pressed his body against her leg, trembling with a confusion that needed no translation. She placed her hand gently on his head, just once, then withdrew it. By morning, the entire camp knew. Prisoners spoke of it in hushed tones. "They're taking her away." Guards exchanged unreadable glances. For some, it was just another change in a long line of changes. For others, especially those who had watched her kneel in the dust that night months ago, it felt like the ending of something fragile and rare. The hours passed with the weight of inevitability. Yuki packed nothing. There was nothing to pack. Her world fit into her hands, a thin blanket, a tin cup, and the memory of a dog she had never expected to care for. She lined up with the others, slated for transfer, each marked by a chalk number on their sleeves. She didn't look back, but Rex did. When the guards tried to lead him away from the loading area, he dug his paws into the dirt, muscles locked. No amount of tugging or coaxing moved him. He positioned himself by the gate, feet planted, gaze fixed on Yuki's small form climbing into the back of the truck. Soldiers muttered that he'd never acted like this before. One joked nervously that the dog had gone soft. No one laughed. When the engine coughed to life, a dusty shudder running through the metal frame, Rex's ears pricked. His eyes never left her. Yuki stared straight ahead, expression carved from stone. But her fingers gripped the edge of the truck a little tighter. The wheels rolled. The truck lurched forward. And as the distance widened, 10 feet, 20, 30, Rex finally broke. He lifted his head and released a single howl. Not a bark, not a cry of pain. A long, low, mourning sound that rose into the morning air and hung there, trembling. The kind of sound that animals make when something they love is taken from them, and they cannot cross the boundary that keeps them apart. Yuki did not turn, but a single tear slipped from the corner of her eye, tracing a clean path down her dust-covered cheek. Rex stood until the truck disappeared beyond the fence line, until the dust settled, until nothing remained but silence. Only then did he sit, and he did not move for a long, long time. Decades passed. The war that once devoured nations became history, then myth. The camp near Amarillo was long gone, torn down, plowed over, returned to the dust. What once was barbed wire and command shacks had grown soft with time. Cottonwoods still swayed at the perimeter, but now they cast shade over tall grass and quiet cattle. The echoes of boots and whistles had been replaced by wind and birdsong. One summer afternoon, an old jeep rumbled down the dirt road that led to the former grounds. Its driver, a man in his 70s with silver hair and a cane tucked beside him, stepped out slowly, his knees protesting. He wore no uniform, only a loose shirt and a sun-faded cap with a patch that read Veteran. His name was Frank Harmon. He had been a young guard back then, barely 18, with more fear than conviction in his bones. He had not returned in all these years, not since they shipped him home, not since the camp closed, but something had pulled him back now. A need, perhaps, to confirm that it had all been real. He limped through the overgrown clearing, guided by memory more than sight. The mess hall had been there, the infirmary to the left, the main gate just beyond the rise. And beneath the lone cottonwood, still standing despite storms and seasons, he paused. There had been a woman and a dog. He hadn't remembered her name. He wasn't sure she ever gave one, but he remembered her face. Not the details, just the feeling it left behind. Curious, he wandered toward the old foundation of the records office, the only building still half standing. Inside, everything had been cleared out, except for a rusted tin box wedged behind a fallen beam. He pulled it free, coughing from the dust, and opened the lid with fingers that trembled more from age than effort. Inside were scraps, old memos, worn ledger pages, forgotten forms typed in triplicate. But beneath them all, tucked flat between 2 sheets of yellowing carbon paper, was a photograph. Black and white, faded at the corners. A woman kneeling in the dirt, her hand resting gently on the back of a German shepherd. Her eyes were turned slightly away from the camera, her mouth neither smiling nor frowning, just still. The dog sat alert, gaze forward, body lean but proud. Behind them, the fence line blurred into the background. Scrawled at the bottom, in shaky handwriting that might have belonged to Conway, were 5 words: Rex and the Nurse, 1945. No other names. Frank stared at it for a long time. A knot rose in his throat that he hadn't expected. He pressed his thumb gently to the corner of the image, as if touching it might make the moment real again. He didn't cry. He only stood there, beneath the cottonwood, letting the years collapse around him like dust settling in a long-abandoned room. The war had asked so much, taken so much. But this fragment, reminded him that something else had lived there too. Dignity, quiet courage, a kind of humanity that never asked for medals, only memory. Frank returned the photo to the box and placed it back where he'd found it. Some things, he thought, belong to the silence. As he climbed into the jeep, the wind picked up, bending the grass into soft waves. He didn't look back. If this story moved you, give it a like and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We read everyone.